I'd given up on a lot of things by the time I turned 32. Given up on the idea that my graphic design business would ever be more than just me and my laptop at the kitchen table. Given up on the gym membership I'd bought in January with all those optimistic resolutions. Given up on dating after one too many awkward coffee meetings that went nowhere. But most of all, I'd given up on the romantic notion that love could just appear in your life when you least expected it, like some scene from a movie where fate intervenes and everything suddenly makes sense. That kind of thing didn't happen to people like me, people who were too quiet, too careful, too stuck in their comfortable routines to take real risks. My apartment was my fortress of solitude, a one-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Chen's television through the floor, and the couple in 3C arguing about whose turn it was to do the dishes. I'd lived there for 4 years, which was longer than I'd lived anywhere since college. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And I'd stopped apologizing for the modest size of my life. The unit next door had been empty for 3 months. Before that, it was occupied by a guy named Derek, who played bass in a band and kept hours that made me feel ancient, even though he was probably only 5 years younger than me. When he moved out to follow his girlfriend to Portland, the silence was actually a relief. I got used to having just one adjacent neighbor, the elderly man on the other side who was quiet as a ghost. So when I heard furniture being moved in on a Saturday morning in late September, I felt that familiar tug of anxiety about who would be invading the space next to mine. I tried to ignore the sounds of boxes being dragged and voices calling out instructions, but curiosity eventually won. I glanced out my peephole and saw a moving guy carrying a small pink bicycle down the hallway. A kid. Great. I had nothing against children in theory, but in practice, they meant noise and chaos and all the things I'd structured my life to avoid. I went back to my laptop, determined to finish the logo design I'd been tweaking for a client. But I couldn't concentrate. The sounds continued for hours, and at one point I heard a girl's voice, bright and chattering, asking questions faster than anyone could answer them. Then a man's voice, patient and warm, telling her to be careful with the boxes marked fragile. It was nearly 6 in the evening when someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I never expected anyone. I opened it to find a man standing there, with a girl who looked about 7 or 8, her dark hair pulled into a ponytail that was coming loose on one side. The man was holding a plate covered with aluminum foil. "Hi," he said, and his smile was apologetic but genuine. "I'm Owen. This is my daughter, Sophie. We just moved in next door, and I wanted to introduce myself. I hope we weren't too loud today." I stood there for a second too long, taking him in. He was maybe an inch taller than me, with light brown hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it all day. He had the kind of face that seemed open and honest, with these grey-blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was wearing a faded college t-shirt and jeans with a hole in one knee, and there was a smudge of dust on his cheek. Something in my chest did a small, unexpected flip. "Oh," I managed. "No, it's fine. I'm Adrian." "Nice to meet you, Adrian. We made too many cookies, and Sophie insisted we share them with the neighbors." He held out the plate, and Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "They're chocolate chip," she announced. "I helped make them. Some of them are a little burned on the bottom, but Dad says that's how they get crispy." I took the plate because it seemed rude not to, even though I couldn't remember the last time a neighbor had brought me homemade anything. "Thank you. That's really nice." "We won't keep you," Owen said, already stepping back. "Just wanted to say hello. If we're ever too loud, just let us know. I know having a kid next door isn't everyone's favorite thing." "It's really fine," I said, and I meant it more than I expected to. There was something about the way he looked at his daughter, protective and gentle, that made my heart squeeze in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. They disappeared back into their apartment, and I closed my door, staring down at the plate of cookies in my hands. I peeled back the foil and took one. It was still warm, and it was actually delicious. Burned bottom and all. Over the next few weeks, I became acutely aware of my new neighbours in ways that surprised me. I could hear Sophie's laughter through the walls and Owen's voice reading bedtime stories. Sometimes I'd hear music playing, usually something old and folky that I wouldn't have expected. I learned their routines without meaning to. Owen left for work at 7:30 every morning, dropping Sophie at school on the way. He'd come home around 6, and I'd hear the sounds of dinner being made, the clink of dishes, the rhythm of their evening routine. I saw them in passing, in the hallway or the lobby. Owen always smiled and said hello, sometimes making small talk about the weather or the building's ancient elevator that broke down every other week. Sophie would wave at me with her whole arm, like we were old friends. I found myself listening for them without realizing it, tuning into the sounds of their life next door, like it was a radio station I couldn't quite turn off. It was about a month after they'd moved in when I ran into Owen in the building's laundry room. It was a Tuesday night, late, because I'd procrastinated on laundry until I was down to my last clean pair of socks. I pushed open the door with my hip, my arms full of a laundry basket, and found him sitting on one of the folding tables, a book open in his lap. He looked up when I came in, and his face brightened in a way that made me feel warm. "Adrian, hey," he said, closing his book. "Didn't expect to see anyone else down here this late." "Yeah, I'm a master procrastinator," I said, loading my clothes into a machine. "Where's Sophie?" "Asleep, hopefully. My neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Martinez. She watches her sometimes when I need to do stuff like this. Sophie thinks she's a grandma on loan." He smiled, but there was something tired around his eyes. I started the machine and turned to leave, but something made me hesitate. "What are you reading?" He held up the book. "Oh, it's this collection of short stories." Probably pretentious of me to bring a book to the laundry room, but I don't get a lot of time to read these days. "No, I get it. Multitasking." I sat down on the table across from him, surprising myself. I wasn't usually one for spontaneous conversation with people I barely knew. We talked while our clothes washed and dried. He told me he worked as a teacher, 8th grade English, which explained the book and the patience I heard in his voice when he talked to Sophie. I told him about my graphic design work, and he seemed genuinely interested, asking questions about my process and what kind of projects I liked best. The conversation flowed easier than I expected, and I found myself noticing details about him. The way he gestured when he talked about his students, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the wedding ring he wasn't wearing, though there was a faint line on his finger where one used to be. "Can I ask you something?" I said, before I could stop myself. "You don't have to answer if it's too personal." "Sure," he said, his expression open. "Sophie's mom. Is she in the picture?" I immediately regretted asking. "Sorry, that's none of my business." "No, it's okay." He looked down at his hands. "She passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. It was fast, which I guess was a mercy in some ways, but it didn't feel like it at the time." "I'm so sorry," I said, and the words felt inadequate. "Thank you. It's been hard, but we're figuring it out. Sophie's resilient. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for." He smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "We moved here for a fresh start. New neighborhood, new school for Sophie. Trying to build something that doesn't have her mum's absence in every corner, you know?" I nodded, even though I didn't really know. I'd never lost anyone like that. I'd never had anyone to lose like that. The dryer buzzed, breaking the moment. We folded our clothes in companionable silence, and when we headed back upstairs, I felt like something had shifted between us. like we'd crossed from neighbors who exchange pleasantries to something more like friends. After that night, we ran into each other more often. Or maybe I just noticed it more. We'd talk in the hallway, conversations that started about nothing and stretched until one of us had to go. He invited me over for dinner one Sunday, and I met Sophie properly for the first time. She was a chatterbox, telling me about her school, and her best friend Emma, and the hamster she wanted, but her dad said they couldn't have because their lease didn't allow pets. I watched Owen in his element, cooking pasta while helping Sophie with her homework at the kitchen table, and I felt something dangerous stirring in my chest. He was so present with her, so patient, even when she asked the same question 3 times because she wasn't really listening. He was a good dad. More than that, he was a good person. The kind of person who brought cookies to new neighbors and read stories with different voices for each character and remembered details from conversations we'd had weeks ago. I started finding excuses to see them. I'd offer to grab their mail when I got mine. I'd knock on their door to ask if they needed anything from the store when I was making a run. Sophie started calling me Mr. Adrian and would tell me about her day whenever she saw me, like I was someone important in her life. And Owen, he started texting me random thoughts during the day. A funny thing a student said. A question about whether I knew how to fix a leaky faucet, which I didn't. But I came over, and we figured it out together anyway. Both of us on our backs under the sink, laughing at our complete incompetence. It was in those small moments that I started to realize what was happening to me. The way my heart would speed up when I heard his key in his door. The way I'd catch myself looking forward to running into him. The way I noticed everything about him. From the way he drank his coffee black, to the fact that he always wore mismatched socks because Sophie thought it was funny. I was falling for him. And it terrified me. I'd dated men before. I'd been out since college, and my family had been mostly okay with it, in that polite way, where they didn't ask too many questions and I didn't offer too many details. But I'd never felt anything like this. This wasn't the casual attraction I'd felt on dating apps, or the mild interest that fizzled out after a few dates. This was something deeper, something that made me want to be a better version of myself, something that made me think about futures and possibilities I'd given up on. But Owen was straight. He'd been married to a woman. He had a daughter. He was grieving his wife and trying to rebuild his life. And I was just the neighbor who he was friendly with because that's the kind of person he was. He was friendly with everyone. Mrs. Martinez across the hall, the mailman, the guy at the coffee shop who always got his order wrong. I tried to pull back, to create some distance before I got in too deep. I stopped texting first. I made excuses when he invited me over. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, so I wouldn't run into him in the lobby. But it was torture. And after a week of avoiding them, Sophie knocked on my door. "Are you mad at us?" she asked when I opened it, her eyes big and worried. "What?" "No, Sophie, of course not." "Then how come you don't come over anymore?" "Dad said you're probably just busy, but I think maybe we did something wrong." My heart broke a little. "You didn't do anything wrong, I promise. I've just been working a lot." She studied me like she didn't quite believe me, and I realized she was smarter than I'd given her credit for. "Okay," she said finally. "But we're having movie night on Friday. Dad says you should come. We're watching a princess movie, but there are also dragons, so it's not too girly." I couldn't say no to her. I didn't want to say no to her. Friday night, I showed up at their door with a bag of popcorn and a box of candy. Sophie answered, already in her pajamas, and dragged me to the couch. Owen was in the kitchen, and when he saw me, his smile was so genuine and warm that I felt my resolve crumbling. "Glad you could make it," he said. "Sophie's been talking about it all week." We settled in to watch the movie, Sophie between us on the couch, and I tried to focus on the animated dragons and the plucky princess, but I was hyper-aware of Owen just a few feet away. At some point, Sophie fell asleep, her head on my shoulder, and Owen carefully lifted her and carried her to her room. I heard him tucking her in, his voice soft as he said goodnight. When he came back, he sat down next to me, closer than before now that Sophie wasn't between us. "Thanks for coming," he said quietly. "I know she really likes you." "She's a great kid," I said, and I meant it. "She is." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I like you too, you know. I'm glad you moved in next door. Or that we moved in next door to you. However that works." I looked at him, and he was looking back at me, and there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read, something open and vulnerable that made my breath catch. "Owen," I started, not knowing what I was going to say. "I know this might be weird," he said, his words coming faster now, like he was nervous. "And you can totally tell me to shut up if I'm reading this wrong. But I think there's something here, between us. And I know I'm probably not what you expected, and I come with a lot of baggage, and I'm still figuring out a lot of things about myself. But I can't stop thinking about you, Adrian, and I needed to tell you that, because I'm terrible at hiding how I feel. And Sophie already asked me why I smile so much when you're around. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. You smile when I'm around. Constantly, apparently." He laughed, but it was shaky. "I've never felt this way about a man before. I didn't know I could. But then you showed up in my life with your quiet kindness and your terrible jokes, and the way you listen to Sophie, like what she's saying actually matters. And I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I want to figure it out with you." I didn't let myself think. I just leaned in and kissed him. It was soft and tentative and perfect. He made a small sound of surprise, and then he was kissing me back, his hand coming up to cut my cheek, and everything else fell away. When we pulled apart, we were both breathing hard. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," I admitted. "Yeah?" His smile was brilliant. "Why didn't you?" "Because I thought you were straight. Because I thought I was just your friendly neighbor. Because I'd given up on believing that this kind of thing could happen to me." "I'm glad you stopped giving up," he whispered, and he kissed me again. We took things slow after that. We had to, with Sophie to consider. Owen sat her down and explained that he and I were dating. In the careful way you explain things to a kid who's already lost one parent and might be scared of losing another. But Sophie just shrugged and said, "Okay. Does this mean Adrian will be around more? Because he's really good at helping with math homework." We figured it out together, the three of us. I learned how to braid hair and which bedtime stories were Sophie's favorites. Owen learned that I needed quiet time to work and that I was useless before my first cup of coffee. Sophie learned that she could make both of us laugh by doing impressions of her teacher. Some nights, after Sophie was asleep, Owen and I would sit on his couch, my head on his shoulder, and talk about everything and nothing. He told me about his wife, about the grief that still caught him sometimes in unexpected moments, and I listened without trying to fix anything. I told him about my fears, about how I'd spent so long protecting myself from disappointment that I'd almost missed out on this. On him. On us. "I'm glad you didn't," he said, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "I'm glad you took the risk." "Me too," I said. And I meant it more than I'd ever meant anything. It wasn't always easy. There were hard days when Owen was overwhelmed by single parenthood and grief, and trying to figure out this new part of his identity. There were moments when I felt insecure, wondering if I was enough, if I could really be what he and Sophie needed. But we talked through it. We were honest with each other, even when it was uncomfortable. We chose each other every day. And that made all the difference. 6 months after that first kiss, I gave up my apartment and moved in with them. It made sense, practically and emotionally. Why pay for 2 places when we were always together anyway? Sophie helped me unpack, carefully arranging my books on the shelf next to hers, and declared that now we were a real family. Standing in our living room, surrounded by boxes and the chaos of combining 2 lives into one, Owen pulled me close and kissed me. "No regrets?" he asked. I looked at Sophie, who was trying to convince us that her room needed repainting in purple, and at Owen, whose eyes were full of love and hope and the promise of all our tomorrows. I thought about the person I'd been a year ago, alone in my apartment, convinced that my small, quiet life was all I deserved. "No regrets," I said. "Not a single one." Because sometimes love doesn't arrive with fanfare and dramatic declarations. Sometimes it moves in next door with a plate of cookies and a little girl with a lopsided ponytail. Sometimes it's patient and gentle and willing to wait for you to catch up. Sometimes it's everything you'd given up on believing in, showing up exactly when you needed it most. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to reach for it, it reaches back.